is Mary Michelle for WVIP, and I'm here today with Danny Martin. He is the director and founder of the International Committees for the Renewal of the Earth. He has a PhD in theology and ecology, and we're going to cover a variety of informational things that I hope you will be interested in, starting with the Celtic history and the story of the Celts. So I want to welcome Danny here with us today.
My pleasure.
Nice.
Mary Michelle.
Good for you to be here. I wanted to ask a little bit about your background with the theology, the Christianity, and the Celts, and how they merged together.
Well, Celtic, I was born in Belfast, Ireland, that is, and lived there. Spent my youth there. I became a Catholic priest, actually, and worked for many years in Africa, so that might explain some of the theology.
Yes, definitely.
And then my interest in ecology came out of, I think, an awareness of what was happening to the land and, as a result, the people of Africa. And then the realization that the same thing was happening to all of us, all around the world. So I came back to this country and I wrote a PhD on ecology and theology, trying to bring those two things together, under a gentleman called Thomas Berry, that you may have heard of.
Sure.
He's written a number of interesting books, like The Dream of the Earth. And he was the one who inspired me to hold those two things together.
Wonderful. Who were some of the other people that you admired and respected? I believe I read or heard in your film clip that we're going to see later about Teilhard de Chardin.
Teilhard de Chardin was a French priest scientist who died in 1955, and perhaps was the first person in this century to begin to bring together again religion and science, which since the 16th century had drifted apart and had become practically enemies to one another. And Teilhard had this wonderful Celtic cosmic vision. Celtic because he was a Gaul, a Celt Frenchman. Cosmic sense of a spiritual unfolding, that the whole universe was a spiritual unfolding from the beginning. So here was a great Celtic sense of the interconnectedness of things.
And did he talk about the Celts? Were these?
He didn't talk directly about the Celts, no, but you can see that spirit, and we would claim it, of course.
Well, sure.
He, by the way, he is buried in this country, and is buried in Poughkeepsie.
Poughkeepsie, that's local.
And what was a Jesuit college is now the Culinary Institute, the American Culinary Institute.
Do you think he would have liked that? One never knows. And what about some of the people today, these architecture people like Buckminster Fuller and Lewis Mumford, and their ideas? Do these tie in a little bit with some of the ideas that you might have with...
Absolutely. Well, Lewis Mumford, who died not so long ago, was a wonderful scientist who also had a great sense that the universe is alive, that the Earth is an organism. It's been developed in more recent times by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, the Gaia
Foundation,
hypothesis, which is now becoming a theory, that the Earth actually is a self-organizing, self-renewing organism. Lewis Mumford comes out of that same kind of sense of the sacredness, if you like, or the aliveness of life, that it's not inert matter that we sort of move around at our convenience as a resource or raw material. Buckminster Fuller comes out of a comparable background in the sense that his focus would be, how do we manage spaceship Earth? One might suggest that that's still a little human-centered, but it is a step in the direction of sustainable human living, and that's really what we're talking about today, in the face of the environmental problems that we have and their social spillover into violence.
Could you talk about this idea of the Celt, the difference between individuation, individuality, and isolation, how they correspond, or perhaps today they don't work as well? In other words, too much individuation might cause. Is that what you were?
Well, I think our modern Western culture, for a variety of reasons that we probably can't go into today, emphasized individualism, analysis at the expense of a larger sense of the whole. Analysis characterizes modern scientific materialism. How do you break things down to their building blocks, their parts, so that you can understand how they work? But there's a danger there that one loses the sense of the whole. That also has spilled over into our society. Individualism, competition, which is not a bad thing, but at the expense of a larger sense of the community. It's clearly what the political conversation is about today. The Celts were individualists, great individuals. The individual soul, your particular contribution to the unfolding of life. You were a co-creator with God. What you did was important and a significant contribution to life, but not at the expense of a community, a sense of the community. I think the link between those two things is an awareness of deep interconnection, deep interconnectedness, how human beings are of the earth, how the earth itself is alive, like we are alive, and that really what's required is, if you like, mutually enhancing human-earth relations. How do we live in a mutually enhancing way with the world in which we live?
And do you believe were the Christians that came in to Ireland or Great Britain after the time of the Celts, did they embrace these ideas as well? Was there a correlation between the Christian and the...
Let me go back just a little bit,
Okay,
if
sure.
I may. One associates the Celts, if one thinks about them at all, with Ireland, the Western Islands of Britain and Ireland and so on. But that's only a 17th and 18th century sort of popularization of linguistic studies. The realization that these people who spoke these languages actually had their roots in the Celtic peoples who emerged in Europe about 3,000 years ago and spread across Europe, reached their high point in what's known as Latin culture. They were, if you like, an aesthetic elite. They were people of flair. They were a loose confederation of tribes that sacked Rome in the 4th century BC, that went down as far as Delphi in the 3rd century BC, that moved as far as Turkey. They spread all over, and they came into Ireland about 300 BC, before the Common Era, as they say. The Christianity which came to Ireland in the early part of the first millennium after Christ, absorbed a lot of, or was rather absorbed by, that Celtic world that they discovered there. So to get back to your kind of question, yes, the Christian movement fitted and married very well with the Celtic spirit, which was probably characterized by flair. You know, the Celts were the other side of the Western psyche. If we see one side of it as Roman, Greek, ordered, centralized, then the Celts were the individual flair, the wild side. Take a walk on the wild side was the Celtic world.
I read too that Chartres, the cathedral in France, that Caesar had written in his treatise on the Celts and so on, that this had been the original place that they considered the center of, or Caesar did, whether the Celts did or not, but that it had originally been a Druidic center.
It was a Druidic center, a place, a famous oak grove. The oaks were sacred to the Celts and to the Druids, who were the priests of the Celtic world, and Chartres was one such, and perhaps the central place in Europe of the time where the Druids would come together for their great convocations. And Chartres Cathedral, which goes back to your question, your reference to Christianity coming into the Western Islands, Ireland and Britain and so forth. Christianity moved across Europe and assimilated many of the elements of what we would call, say, the ancient religion, in this case the Celtic religion, assimilating the elements of the seasons, the seasonal feasts. So
then we're going to get into the discussion of the festivals.
Yes.
Right. I think, though, we're going to have to take a little break here, and we're going to have a look at a 3-minute clip of your film on Celtic spirituality that will perhaps add a little additional information to this discussion that I'm having here today with Danny Martin. So we'll be back in a few minutes.
The old Irish woman was speaking about fairies. I don't believe in them myself, says she, but they're there. And heaven, she added, is about 1.5 feet above the height of a man. The Celts have always been a deeply spiritual people in the sense that they live in a world that is rich with spirits and angels and saints, that is alive with sacredness and glimpses of eternity. I will kindle my fire this morning in the presence of all the holy angels of heaven would be a way of starting a day that was seen as a creative partnership with God. Bless, O God, my little cow. Bless, O God, my desire. Bless thou my partnership and the milking of my hands, O God. A poem attributed to St. Bridget captures an even deeper sense of intimacy with the divine world. I would like a great lake of beer for the King of Heaven. I would like to be watching heaven's family drinking it through all eternity. A rich world indeed. But if they had a sense of heaven, it was a heaven in the here and now, in the core of things, in the deep heart's core, and in the wonder that was found in the very heart of things, in the ordinary things, if we would let them. St. Kevin was one who was renowned for this connection to this kind of heaven through his relationship with animals. One day, the great ascetic was praying with outstretched arms when a blackbird came and perched on his hand. Well, of course, the saint didn't disturb her. In fact, when she went away and came back again with material to build a nest, he still didn't take his hands down. In fact, he remained praying with outstretched arms until the bird had laid her eggs and hatched out her brood. Of course, the animals reciprocated his love in various forms, like the otter who retrieved his prayer book that he had dropped into the lake, or the doe that brought him milk every day for a child that he had taken under his care. Kevin, in fact, was one of the great saints who were the inspiration of the Celtic Christians. It was the wisdom and holiness of these men and women that taught and protected God's people and won for Ireland the title of Isle of Saints and Scholars.
This is Mary Michelle for VIP, and I'm back with Danny Martin, and we're going to talk a little bit about the festival of Beltane?
Well, it's pronounced differently,
Okay.
variously. Beltane.
Okay.
Bel was the sun god
Right.
for the Celts, and Tina is the Irish word for fire. So they celebrated the sun, obviously through the use of fire. That was the great symbol of life. And it happened at the beginning of May, our May Day, when they celebrated the germination of the seed. This was the time of aliveness. And this was the time also when they purified the cattle. They would run the cattle through the fires to purify them of all the bad karma that they had developed while they were winterized, when they stayed at home. Then they sent them out to the field. So it was the time of the light had returned. So the Celtic...
Were there horse races then? Were horses important?
Horse racing was part of the great big celebration of the lusty month of May, as they say in Camelot.
Right.
Yes, yeah. And the horse, of course, was sacred to the Celt in a variety of ways. Probably the Celts became mobile. I mentioned that they were a confederation of tribes in Europe. The horses came from the steppes, the Russian steppes. As the Celts integrated that into their culture, then they became mobile and were able to move across the rest of Europe. And of course that holds to the present day, where the Irish in particular have a great love of the horse.
And white horses were particularly sacred, as most things in Druidic culture, with the mistletoe and the white cloaks. Do you know why white was such an important color?
I think also the sense of light and the sense of the sun. Yeah, that would brought life into. This was a fairly northern country, and the Celts were associated with the northern climate, so light was the symbol of life, the sun. And in the Celtic Christian world, that became the Son of God.
And of course, they measured these places at places like Stonehenge, which isn't actually Celtic.
It predates the Celts. Stonehenge is probably at least 3,000 years, 3,500 years old. There's even a place in Ireland, a big burial chamber called Newgrange, which predates Stonehenge. But the Celts absorbed the pantheon of the gods, in other words, and the customs and feasts of the places that they moved into. The Celts were great absorbers, assimilators. And they did the same thing with Christianity. It wasn't so much a question of Christianity coming and imposing itself on the Celtic world, but rather the Celtic world absorbed the elements of Christianity. And it was a very interesting marriage, in fact, and quite a unique form of Christianity, unlike, if you like, the Roman or the later Reformation Christianity that we've come to know. It was one that was much more ecological, which is a close love of mine, a sense of the immanence, the presence of God in everything, how everything was alive, and how the human was a co-creator with life. So it offers a marvelous inspiration for a new way of human beings dealing with change and living in the world today.
Do you think that the Picts were, could they have had anything to do? I know I have this wonderful picture of this Pict warrior who, as Caesar said about the Celts, they went into war oftentimes in a spiritual frenzy and might not...
And quite naked.
Quite... Right. So, do you think that the Picts might have been involved in any of these early places of worship?
Well, certainly the Picts, they were the indigenous people of Scotland, modern-day Scotland. They may have been an earlier movement of Celtic peoples who came into those islands before what we know as the modern Celts, who came from probably Galicia, and they were Milesian Celts from Spain. The Celts, those Celts, warred with the Picts during the early centuries of the first millennium. But the Picts themselves, as I said, could have been Celts. They were similar, certainly, in some of their characteristics,
right.
Their flair.
Yes, right. I think one of the wonderful things that we all think of with the Irish is this wonderful sense of rhythm and time, and it seems to be pervasive in the poetry, in the music, in the way of speaking, in the difficulty in keeping things short, the stories short.
Why would you say something in 2 words when you could use a page?
Exactly, right.
But that sense of the rhythm and the sense of the connectedness is captured by many Irish poets, of course. Let me just share a verse or two of one. This is W.B. Yeats, a marvellous Irish poet, and it's the song of wandering Angus, who was the son of the great god Dagda. And Angus had a dream of a girl that he fell in love with in his dream, and when he awoke he searched for her. It's a long story, typically in Celtic fashion, but finally he found her, and she was a swan, and she agreed to marry him on condition, a white swan, on condition that she could be a swan 1 year and a woman the other year. And he actually joined her for the years that she was a swan. And Yeats takes up this wonderful poem, and it's the search for reconnection, the search for a soul that we experience in our society today. I'll just give you the first couple of verses. I went out to the hazelwood because a fire was in my head, and cut and peeled a hazel wand and hooked a berry to a thread. And when white moths were on the wing and moth-like stars were flickering out, I dropped the berry in a stream and caught a little silver trout. And it goes on and on like this, and it's full of symbolism, because the hazel tree was the symbol of magic, and the trout was the symbol of wisdom, and going back to the natural world to find yourself, which is essentially what the poem is about, offers once again the kind of Celtic inspiration that we're talking about.
What about mistletoe?
Mistletoe is a wonderful symbol of fertility because it has berries during the wintertime.
Ah, okay.
And so that it was sacred, apparently, to the Druids, and legend shows the Druids cutting down these wonderful berries and grinding them up for herbs, as well as keeping them as symbols of fertility for the rest of the year.
And this idea of the Hindu, the Brahmin connection with the Druids and the Celts, and also the Persian Magi, have you... Is this a
well,
connection?
the Celts were of Indo-European stock in Northern Europe, so that whole group of peoples split, bifurcated. One group gave birth to the Celt as we know it, and another group gave birth to the Indian peoples, the Aryan people, and the Sanskrit language and so forth. And there are some comparisons that have been drawn out linguistically.
Terra, I think, is to me the most striking, because it's so important in the Irish. Is it the Mound of Terra?
The Hill of Terra.
The Hill of Terra.
Which is the centre place of that place where the High King lived.
And of course the color green that's attached to it. And also in the Hindu Brahmin connection, she's also green and
green, fertile,
Yeah.
lush,
Yeah.
verdant.
Yeah.
And it's that aliveness that characterizes the Celt. And it is a wonderful inspiration for today's world. And it's the kind of work that I'm trying to do. You mentioned at the beginning the international committees. What that group was at the beginning was the International Coordinating Committee on Religion and the Earth. Now, there's a title.
Right.
But essentially, it was a group of religious people who came together to create an Earth Charter in preparation for the UN Summit, you remember, in
Yes.
Rio in 1992.
Yes.
And developed this Earth Charter, which emerged as one of the better non-governmental UN documents. Well, after that, I used it as an inspiration for groups to try to look at life in a more sustainable way in today's world. Everything from education to business to religion to health. And out of this work emerged groups of people around the country. And what's happening to the organization now is that the name is beginning to shift. And we're talking about calling it Cross River Connections.
Much easier name to
Easier
remember.
to remember.
Rhythm, it has that nice rhythm again. Yeah, that's great.
And so what I try to do with these groups is to offer a little inspiration in the form of talks and workshops, some resources in the form of packages and tapes and materials and so on, some networking in the form of a newsletter, and I can give you the number of that you can call
Great.
if you want to be on the mailing list for these resources. We even run trips, but let me give you that phone number if I may first.
Okay,
Could I do that?
definitely.
This is actually in Maryland. It's 301-371-7123, and it's Bernie Anderson.
Okay.
My own number is 914-763-5790, the office out of which I work.
But please call Danny for these trips that he organizes, because they sound particularly interesting. And one thing I wanted to ask you was about Iona and the Book of Kells. Could you tell us a little bit about the Book of Kells?
Well, it'll give me an opportunity for another commercial, but yes, the Book of Kells is associated with Columba, who was the founder of this monastic settlement on the island of Iona, which is in the Inner Hebrides in Scotland. The Book of Kells is the best known of these marvelous books that the Celtic monks, the Christian monks, transcribed, and as a result preserved the literature and the culture of Europe, which was devastated by the northern tribes in what we call the Dark Ages. And the Celtic monks then became wandering scholars who put in the foundations for modern Western civilization. But to go back to Iona, Columba, I run a conference there with two friends of mine on the island of Iona in May every year. We attract about 40 or 50 people.
Beltane?
Well, just a little bit after, but in the lusty month of May, nonetheless, even on this island of Iona. And the number to call there is 360-341-5430 to get information on that marvelous trip. It's a week long. It's in the little hotel that we take over. It's beside the Abbey on the island of Iona. And the island is a mile long by half a mile wide, and it is a place of magic, what they call a thin place.
And Columba, the image of Columba is a bird, right? A white bird?
The dove, actually.
The dove, yes.
He was called, in Latin, Columba is the word for dove. In Irish, in Gaelic, Columkill, he was known as Columkill, which is the dove of the church.
Oh, and speaking of Irish heroes, we were going to mention this
Cuchulainn.
Cuchulainn.
You're covering a lot of ground here.
We're trying.
Well, we're bouncing back and forth, and it's interesting too, because the Celts had a more cyclical sense of time than a linear one. So people often found themselves in different centuries, and Bridget and Patrick, for example, were associated as being contemporaries when in fact they were not. But Cuchulainn was the northern hero from Ulster, and associated with that great cycle of literature, a marvelous warrior who could change form and scare the bejabbers out of his enemies. But I think it's most important to remember that the hero in the Celtic world was one who brought in the new era, who was a transition person, who had great patience and discipline, and who wasn't afraid to step out on a limb and to foster change.
And this is a part of the way that you're working in terms of helping people learning how to communicate better? Is this part of the...
Well, part of the work that we do with Cross River Connections is to offer some training to the groups in a methodology called Dialog that was developed by the quantum physicist David Bohm. It's to help people to think together and to come together and think more creatively so that we can translate or retool our institutions for today's society.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
And so you do this with public health, and you do it with...
well, my own work sort of is...